A date which will live in infamy.
Both
of those projects, initiatives, got off the ground because of the Ger Rebbe.
The 11 Olympic team members slain in West Germany. The Olympic Games.
Zugerecht waren Brüder in Amerika. Vertrauten Schabbat, es ist getan.
Out of the 24 who were killed were Americans who had come to learn in Hebron.
I say 1 million Jewish children who were made to be Katnusas.
Whoever heard such beautiful words,
it is never too little, it is never too late, and it is never enough.
Jewish History Soundbites, bringing alive the world of our glorious past. Here is our host, live from Jerusalem, Jewish historian and tour guide, Yehuda Geberer.
Welcome, everyone, to Jewish History Soundbites. This is Yehuda Geberer with another episode of Jewish History Soundbites. And our Malava Malka episode tonight will talk a little bit about the Ruzhin, Sadigura, Hasidic dynasty, and how dynastic succession works, and are there age requirements in dynastic succession, not only in the Hasidic world, but in everywhere else also. Just want to read a letter I got last week. The Malava Malka episode is about the Satmar Rav. We got quite a bit of feedback from listeners about the Satmar Rav. I just chose one of them to share, and I'm going to quote part of the letter. You mention that during the Satmar Rav's visit in 1958 to London, Harry Goodman published in an Aguda publication that the Satmar Rav donated to Chinuch Atzmai. Correction number 1, the Satmar Rav did not visit London in 1958. En route to Eretz Yisrael, he stopped over in London either in 1955 or 1959. Correction number 2, I heard it this Motzei Shabbos from a Heisbacher of the Satmar Rav. He was once present when a fundraiser came to the Rebbe for Chinuch Atzmai. The Rebbe refused to donate for ideological reasons, but added that you make parnasa out of this and you don't have to suffer. Here is money for you personally. Okay, end of that letter. So, of course, at the end of the day, so there seems to be agreement that the Rav donated to Chinuch Atzmai. There seems to be a dispute why he did. So, there's obviously going to be different versions of the story. So, we're going to go into talk a little bit about Sadigura. It was in the news this week, and a lot of people are asking me about it over the week. And I want to make a disclaimer before I get into anything, and I want to make sure it's a very clear disclaimer. This is not contemporary. I don't do anything contemporary, and our great community of listeners knows me by now. You want to find out about Sadigura today and about the Rebbe today, you can read all the news blogs, and there's lots of people have plenty of things to say. You can go ahead and find out there. If you want to find out about the Rebbe who just passed away, there's also lots out there, including Srili Belzer, just wrote a beautiful article in the Mishpacha magazine about the previous Sadigura Rebbe. So if you want to find out about those two topics, this is not the address. I'm here just for some historical context, give a little bit of the background of the dynasty and about how succession works and ages and stuff like that. And I'm definitely not taking any sides. Just an outside observer telling a story of the past, which I try to do. And so that's just give a little bit of a background. And the reason I'm getting into it is because over the week, with all the news and everything, got a lot of questions from a lot of listeners. And it's making big news for such a small Hasidus. It's a very tiny court, and it's very significant. It's very historically important, and very amazing people have led it over the years. But it's definitely not a huge player today in the in the Hasidic world. But still, it's important, so we're going to talk about it. And there's really two stories going on here. There's the continuation of the Ruzhin Dynasty, the Ruzhin Sadigura Dynasty, and it's essentially one of the last Friedmans, Ben Achar Ben, direct descendants of male descendants carrying the name Friedman from the Ruzhiner himself. So that's one story. And another story is age, is a young successor, and what is the story of young successors throughout history. There's really a third story, and it's a story of succession dispute, but I prefer to stay away from that. Definitely not going to get into it at all in this episode. Though in Ruzhin, it's actually historically been quite rare, if ever. There's not that many succession disputes in the Ruzhin dynasty. There's a lot of other dynasties that it's quite common. But I want to get a little bit of an overview of how we come to that there's almost no Friedmans in the great Ruzhin dynasty, the direct male descendants from the Ruzhiner of Israel Friedman, the Heilige Ruzhiner, the founder of the dynasty. So there's many, many branches. And we come down to Sadigura today, and it's really one of the last ones that still carries the name Friedman. How did that come to be? And that's really what's significant. One of the things that's very significant here. It's one of the real, links to have to the Ruzhiner. So let's start with the easy ones. Obviously the dynasties that married into Ruzhin originally, like Vishnitz or Vasloi or Kapishnitz, etc. Others, they are obviously not Friedmans because they married into daughters or granddaughters, great-granddaughters of the Ruzhiner. So they're important, and some of them large dynasties, but they're not Friedmans. Okay, so we move on to the Romanian branch of Ruzhin. One of the sons of the Ruzhiner started the Shtefanesht branch. Now, the second Rebbe of Shtefanesht was the Rav Mattisyahu Friedman, an amazing Rebbe. He was Rebbe for 64 years. We'll get back to him soon. And he had no children. So in the 1930s, when he passed away, the dynasty ended. He actually had designated his nephew, Rav Nachman Friedman of Itzkan, who was a fascinating individual, which perhaps we'll speak about another time. But he wanted him to be his continuation. He was his nephew. He was a Friedman, but he passed away before he did. He passed away at a very young age. So when Rav Mattisyahu Friedman, the second Shtefanesht Rebbe, who was eventually transferred, his body was transferred to be reburied in Israel, in Tel Aviv, where all the Ruzhiner Rebbes are buried, in Givatayim, outside of Tel Aviv. So the dynasty essentially came to an end. Okay, that's Shtefanesht. We move over to Husyatin, another Ruzhin branch. Rabbi Yisrael Friedman passed away in Tel Aviv at the age of 92 as the last grandchild of the Ruzhiner and the living grandchild of the Ruzhiner. His son-in-law, Rabbi Yaakov Friedman, became the Husyatin Rebbe, and he passed away in 1956. After a few years, his son, Rabbi Yitzchak Friedman, became the Husyatin Rebbe, and he was this last Husyatin Rebbe. He never got married, interestingly enough, and when he passed away in 1968, so the Husyatin dynasty ended. And we come to Chortkiv, one of the biggest and most important and central branches of the dynasty and of the Hasidic world in general, in Galicia, in the interwar period, in Poland and other places. The very famous Rabbi Yisrael Friedman of Chortkiv, who was a leader in Agudas Yisrael, and his famous chassid Rav Meir Shapiro of Daf Yomi and Yeshivas Chachmei Lublin. So Rabbi Yisrael Friedman passes away in 1933. Now, one son was Reb Dov Ber. He eventually moves to London, but the Hasidic court there didn't really take off, though he had I think they have still a base medrash either in London or Manchester, somewhere in England. And so that there is something Chortkiv, a base medrash, but not really a major Hasidic court. The dynasty kind of ended over there. Though this Rabbi Yisrael Friedman had another son, Reb Nachman Mordechai, an older son, Reb Nachman Mordechai Friedman, who moved to Israel and Eretz Yisrael and passed away in 1946 when we do our Har HaZeisim tours. We go to his kever, and either real or virtual tours, and of course virtual lectures also. You could be in touch with me about that, as you can about sponsorships for episodes. Either way, so this Reb Nachman Mordechai, the Chortkiv Rebbe, his son Reb Shloima, became the next Chortkiv Rebbe, and he passes away at a relatively young age in 1958, and the dynasty kind of petered out and came to an end in 1958. So Chortkiv no longer as well. We come now to Bayan, a famous and important, and today a very large Hasidic dynasty. So that's very much alive and well, definitely still around and growing and, very important and central in the Hasidic world of today. So Bayan comes from the Pachad Yitzchak of Bayan, Rabbi Yitzchak Friedman, who is the older son of Rabbi Avram Yaakov of Sadigura. And I emphasize he was the older son, and after a few years of joint leadership with his younger brother, Rabbi Israel Friedman of Sadigura, the younger brother got the Sadigura Hasidus, and the older brother, Rabbi Yitzchak, moved to another suburb of Chernovitz, right? Chernovitz was the main city, and Sadigura was a suburb, so he moved to another suburb called Bayan, and he started the Bayan dynasty. And he passes away in Vienna in 1917, and all four sons of his become Bayan Rebbes. One in Chernovitz, whose son-in-law, Reb Moshe Friedman, was a major leader of Polish Jewry in the interwar period. In Krakow, he was killed, unfortunately, by the Nazis. In Leipzig, there was a Bayan Rebbe, another son of the Pachad Yitzchak. He escaped to Israel after the Nazis came to power, and he passed away without any descendants. And then there was another brother in Lvov. He was called Lemberg, after the German name of the city. And he was killed by the Nazis, him and his family. And they were left with the fourth and last son of the Pachad Yitzchak of Bayan, Reb Mordechai Shlomo Friedman. And he was in New York. He became the Bayan Rebbe in the Lower East Side of New York. And when he passed away in 1971, Bayan's future was in doubt. This was it. He was the last Friedman of Bayan. And eventually his daughter's son, the current Rebbe of Bayan, Rav Nachman of Breslov, eventually becomes the current Rebbe, and a very important and amazing person also. The leader of Bayan today, but he's a Breyer. He's a grandson does not carry the Friedman name, so it's different. Now there is another branch of the dynasty, Buhush. Rabbi Yitzchak Friedman of Buhush was a son-in-law of the first Buhush Rebbe, but still he was a Friedman because they all were direct descendants of the Ruzhiner, and he became the Buhush Rebbe in Bucharest, in Romania, during the war. In Bucharest, the war didn't exactly reach Bucharest, so he was safe, and he stays the Rebbe for about half a century, like almost all the Rebbes of the Ruzhin Dynasty. He settled in Tel Aviv, and like many other Rebbes of the Ruzhin Dynasty, especially Husyatin, but others as well, which is a topic for another time. We covered it partially in the Rabbis and Zionists series. You can check it out there. But the Buhush and Husyatin and other Rebbes of Ruzhin were Zionistic. The Buhush Rebbe was very much Zionistic, and when he passed away in the 1990s, his grandson through his daughter is the current Rebbe of Buhush, Rabbi Yaakov David Mendel Leib Friedman. So he's a Friedman, so we have that there, but he has strayed from the Ruzhin path and is very anti-Zionist. He's taken a different ideological path. In that context, it's actually worth mentioning another Buhush offshoot, the Pashkan Hasidus, and which is also still Friedman's, very Zionist. They're actually completely a unique Hasidic court. It's a completely Dati Leumi, a religious Zionist Hasidic court. Until recently, it was Rabbi Yisrael Friedman, who was the Rebbe, and he passed away a couple of years ago. And now his son, who's a retired general in the Israeli army, Rabbi Hoshea Friedman, is the Pashkana Rebbe. And now we finally come to Sadigura, which was the point of all this. Rabbi Yisrael Friedman, who was the second Rebbe of Sadigura, like I mentioned, he left a few children. One of his famous children was Rav Yaakov Friedman of Sadigura. He was a very central leader of Agudas Yisrael. There's lots to say about him. He's actually a very interesting person. Perhaps we'll try to get to him another time. And he also moved to Tel Aviv. He passed away in 1960 without any descendants. He had no children. His older brother was Rabban Friedman, who passed away at a young age, and his son, Reb Mordechai Shalom Yosef Friedman, was a Rebbe for the incredible amount of 66 years. And he was in Tel Aviv also, like all the other Ruzhiner Rebbes. And then when he passed on, his son, Rav Yaakov Friedman. This is actually the third Rav Yaakov Friedman of Sadigura. It's like Rav Yaakov the third, like in all the royal families. They have like the third and the fourth, so it's like that, the regal families of Ruzhin as well. In any case, so when Rav Yaakov the third passed away, his son, Rabbi Yisrael Moshe Friedman, became the Sadigura Rebbe, and he's the one who passed away last week. And so it's now his children who are still Friedmans, direct Friedman descendants. They're from Sadigura, and that's the continuation of the dynasties. That's how we get to the fact that it's very few Friedmans left, and how Sadigura is an important branch of this dynasty. Some of the branches don't even exist anymore, and therefore it's a historic moment. In any event, we come to ages. And throughout history, I see that people are making a big deal about the ages and how old and how young. And young succession has been very common across the boards throughout Jewish history and general history, by the way. Young Rebbes, young Roshei Yeshiva, young communal rabbis, in the Ruzhin Dynasty and everywhere else, in the Sephardic world, in the general world, and kings and royal families of different countries throughout the world, throughout history. And literally the examples are endless. I decided to pick a few random examples, and I'm sure there are hundreds more, so this is just a sampling, and you don't have to tell me that I missed out a few. I'm not trying to give a comprehensive list here. Just a few random examples that popped into my head to share about young people who rose to amazing positions of leadership at quite a young age. Rav Chaim Brisker, Rav Chaim Soloveitchik, who married a granddaughter of the Netziv of Volozhin, so by virtue of his being a granddaughter, he married to a granddaughter of the Rosh Yeshiva, so he was appointed as the assistant Rosh Yeshiva in Volozhin at the age of 27, quite a young age. Rav Moshe Feinstein, his first rabbinate was not really a real rabbinate. He was taking over his brother-in-law or uncle or something, some relative in Reisen for half a year. He did that at the age of 18. He rose to the rabbinate. Then he starts a yeshiva with his brother at the age of 20, as Rav Moshe Feinstein. And then when he was 21, he got the rabbinate in Uzda to get out of the draft, but he took it seriously, and it was actually a real rabbinate. It lasted 2 years, and he continued his career as a rabbi after that. So 18, 20, 21 is when his career took off as a rabbi. Needless to say, he was single all this time. Rav Ovadiah Yosef got smicha in Parat Yosef when he was 20. He became a dayan in a bezdin when he was 25, and he was the rabbi in Egypt when he was 27 years old. And once we're on the topic of the Sephardic world, so the Ben Ish Chai, Rabbi Yosef Chaim of Baghdad. Baghdad was one of the largest Jewish communities in the Muslim world. It was a learned community. It was a wealthy community. It was an important Jewish city. And the Ben Ish Chai became the rabbi when he was 25 years old. World leaders, it's common. Queen Elizabeth became the Queen of England when she was 25 or 26. King Hussein of Jordan, whose peace with Israel was a lot more significant than the Emirates' peace with Israel that happened just recently, because it was with Jordan, country they're at war with. It was an important peace that was made. King Hussein of Jordan became king when he was 16 years old. Puyi, the last emperor of China before the revolution, he was 2 years old when he became the emperor of China. And of course, Hirohito, the very famous or infamous emperor of Japan, who was during World War II and way beyond that. He lived on to the 1980s. A lot to say about him. And now it's the weeks of the end of World War II, the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II, which was the surrender of Japan, which he was involved with. So in the negotiations of the unconditional surrender, where the condition was that he had to stay as emperor, but that's another story. MacArthur's concession, we'll talk about that another time. But either way, Hirohito of Japan became emperor when he was 25 years old. But getting back to the Hasidic world, the current Belzer Rebbe, Rabbi Yisachar Dov Rokeach, became the Rebbe when he was 18 years old. Became the Rebbe. There was no Rebbe. His uncle had passed away many years before. And of course, it's famous in the Karlin Hasidic dynasty. There was the Yenuka of Stolin, Rabbi Stroll of Stolin, who was buried in Frankfurt. And he was 4.5 when his father passed away, but he was crowned, so to speak, the Rebbe at his bar mitzvah when he was 13 years old. similar to the current Rebbe of Karlin Stolin, the current Rebbe who's alive today and live and be well, doing amazing things. And he became the Rebbe when he was like 9, he sort of became the Rebbe, and he officially became the Rebbe when he was 13 years old. And like I mentioned earlier, the current Bayan Rebbe was made the Rebbe when he was 25 years old. If we can move over to the business world, and we'll only pick Jews to make it connected to Jewish history. Michael Dell, who's Jewish, when he was 27 years old, he was the CEO of a Fortune 500 company, but he was a lot younger when he started the company. And of course, even more famously is Mark Zuckerberg, who launched Facebook when he was 20 years old. And we go to the yeshiva world. Reb Aaron Kotler was 22 when he became a Rebbe in the Slutsk yeshiva by his father-in-law, Rav Isser Zalman, and he was 29 when he built Kletsk across the border in Poland, and he was the Rosh Yeshiva. He was the sole Rosh Yeshiva. Rav Isser Zalman stayed behind in Slutsk. Reb Aaron Kotler, and once we're on the topic of the Kotler, Sir Malkiel Kotler, the current Rosh Yeshiva of the largest yeshiva in the world, he became the Rosh Yeshiva of the largest yeshiva in the world when he was 32 years old. He's a little older already, but still quite young. And similarly, Rav Yeshua Soloveitchik, the current Rosh Yeshiva of Brisk, became the Rosh Yeshiva of Brisk when he was 31 years old. But there was another very amazing person who's not so famous, Reb Baruch Shimon Solomon, who became from a famous an important rabbinic family, descended from Rav Moshe Landinsky of Radin, a lot of Solomons who were big rabbis in Israel and other places. So Reb Baruch Shimon Solomon became the Rav and Rosh Yeshiva of the Nachlas David Yeshiva in Petach Tikva. When he was 26 years old, he became a rabbi of 2 neighborhoods in Petach Tikva and the Rosh Yeshiva, founding Rosh Yeshiva of a yeshiva. Amazingly young age. Very impressive person also. Reb Shmuel Salant became the rabbi and Av Bezdin in Yerushalayim at the age of 25, and he remained there for about 70 years. Interestingly enough, there were 3 young married individuals who started the Telz Yeshiva well before Belzer Gordon came to Telz in Lithuania. The 3 people who started Telz were Reb Zalman Abel, who was 18 years old, Reb Tzvi Yaakov Oppenheim, who was 21, and Reb Meir Atlas, who was 27. So they 3 started what became the Telz Yeshiva. Reb Moshe Mordechai Epstein was hired by the Alter of Slobodka to become the Rosh Yeshiva of Slobodka when he was 28. And his younger brother-in-law, Rav Isser Zalman Meltzer, was hired at the same time to become the Rosh Yeshiva of Slobodka at the whopping age of 23 years old, 24 perhaps. And then 3 years later, when he was 27, he started the yeshiva of Slutsk. He became the founding Rosh Yeshiva of Slutsk. Rav Nachman of Breslov, we're coming closer to Rosh Hashanah, and there's big discussions if we're going to be able to go to Uman this year. So Rav Nachman of Breslov started off when he was to become a Rebbe at 18 years old. Now we move on to the Ruzhiner dynasty itself. So we might as well start with the founder himself. So the Ruzhiner himself becomes the Rebbe before he even arrives in Ruzhin when he was 16 years old. This is following his brother Rav Avram's passing, who had become Rebbe at 15. And the Ruzhiner becomes Rebbe when he was 16. This brother, Rebbe Avram, his older brother, was probably the first Yenuka, the first young Rebbe. Now, another descendant who I mentioned earlier, Rav Moshe Friedman, the famed Rebbe of Shtefanesht, he was the Rebbe for 64 years. He became the Shtefanesht Rebbe at the age of 22. Now, we go even closer. In the Sadigura dynasty itself, Rav Mordechai Shalom Yosef Friedman of Sadigura, 4th generation from the Ruzhiner and grandfather of the Rebbe who just passed away last week. So he became the Rebbe at the age of 16. This Rav Mordechai Shalom Yosef Friedman of Sadigura. Not only that, but his oldest son did not become the Rebbe. The next son, Rav Yaakov, did. So that's another thing, and that brings us to the last interesting thing of history. Have there been instances where it wasn't, sometimes it was the younger son, the older son, both? There's been many examples like that. I'll just give a few. First of all, we mentioned in the Kapust episode about how the Maharash, the 4th Rebbe of Chabad, Lubavitch, after the Tzemach Tzedek passed away, so the youngest son, Reb Shmuel of the Maharash, he became the Rebbe, while the older ones, he became the Rebbe in Lubavitch, while the older ones set up their own courts in other cities. It was very common back in the day, and the reason is, and you have to understand the context, the older children got a position in some other town, either as a rabbi or either as a Rebbe while the father was still alive. The ones who were still by the father when he passed away was usually the younger ones. It was actually more common for the younger children to become the Rebbe in the town where the father was, continuing his dynasty when the father passed away. The best example of that is obviously the Rav Chaim of sons. His oldest son, was in Shiniv, and then he had sons in Garlitz and Kshanov and other places, and it was his fourth son, Reb Aaron, who got the rabbinate in Sanz. But there's many other examples of that. In Varka, for instance, after Reb Yitzchak of Varka passed away, first his students took over, which was still common in Polish Hasidus at that time. Later on, his younger son, Reb Mendel, becomes the Rebbe in Varka, while his older son, Reb Yaakov David, becomes the first Rebbe of Amshinav. In Radomsk also was similar. Also an interesting example because they actually split it. When the Tiferes Shleima of Radomsk passed away, the older son, Reb Tzvi Meir, took over the rabbinate, which was the primary position of the Tiferes Shleima. That's what he was the rabbi of Radomsk for many years, and he only became the Rebbe, the Hasidic Rebbe, much later. And the younger son of Rav Yisachar Ber, Rabinowitz of Radomsk, the second Rebbe, he became the Rebbe of Radomsk. Either way, there's just a few examples and just a fun overview to get a little bit of a background about how these things work throughout history. And again, I'm just making it clear I'm not getting into the contemporary at all. So this was Yehuda Geber with Jewish History Soundbites. You can reach me at yehuda@yehudageber.com for questions, comments, sources, tours and trips, virtual tours, real lectures online lectures, and sponsorships. Be in touch with me about that as well. You can subscribe to Jewish History Soundbites on Podbean. Follow us on Twitter at JSoundbites, and I hope you enjoyed.